How do relationships manage to last? I mean, the really long ones, decades together. Is it, some kind of magic, pure luck? Or is there actually something we can figure out?
That really is the big question, isn't it?
Yeah.
And it's exactly what we're digging into today. We've pulled together a pretty wide range of sources for this deep dive.
Ooh.
Everything from academic research, psychological studies, the kind you'd find on PubMed,
Hmm.
plus insights from think tanks like Pew Research looking at modern dating,
Right.
and even stuff from places like Harvard Medical School and what people are actually saying in online forums like Reddit.
Okay, so a real mix. And our mission here is basically to sift through all that, pull out the key insights, maybe some surprising facts, and help you understand what the research and just real world experience tells us about building connections that actually last and stay fulfilling.
Absolutely. It's a broad look. We want to move beyond just that initial spark,
Yeah.
to figure out what really sustains people through years, decades, all the changes life throws at you.
Because that first feeling, whatever pulls you in, that's probably not the only thing keeping you together when things get tough, right?
Exactly. Research shows pretty clearly that after that early, often very passionate attraction phase,
Hmm.
the relationship dynamics, they change, they evolve.
How so?
Well, what becomes really crucial over the long haul is stuff like cognition, basically. How partners think about each other, about the relationship itself, and a different kind of love often kicks in, sometimes called companionate love.
Companionate love.
Yeah, it's built more on like deep affection, trust, real familiarity. It's maybe less about that intense thrill and more about a comfortable, supportive warmth.
So, like shifting from fireworks to a really cozy fireplace. Is that a fair analogy?
That's a pretty good way to put it, yeah.
Yeah.
But importantly, research suggests that cozy fire can still have some serious sparks. We'll definitely get into that later.
Okay.
But first, let's talk about that feeling of being, well, close.
How do researchers even measure something like closeness? It feels so subjective.
Well, some methods are surprisingly simple. There's a famous one by Arthur Aaron and his colleagues. They use this visual scale, just pairs of overlapping circles.
Oh, the circles. I've seen those diagrams.
Yeah, representing self and other. They range from barely touching to almost completely merged. People just pick the picture that feels like their relationship.
And that simple picture thing is actually used in serious research.
It absolutely is.
Hmm.
And simple as it sounds, that measure of perceived closeness, it's turned out to be a really strong predictor of relationship satisfaction and whether couples actually stay together.
Wow.
Sometimes it's even more predictive than just counting up how many positive feelings partners say they have for each other.
That's fascinating. So it's not just like a checklist of good moments, but this deeper feeling of being intertwined, merged almost.
Precisely. It seems to be tied into how partners' sense of self can actually blend together a bit over time.
Yeah.
And that's supported by things like mutual acceptance, caring for each other, strong social support within the relationship itself.
Okay, let's get practical then. How do relationships handle the everyday give and take? The chores, the effort. Does keeping things strictly 50-50 work long term?
Well, research suggests that as relationships deepen, they tend to shift away from what's called an exchange-based model.
Exchange-based, like transactional.
Yeah, exactly. Early on, it might be more like, I paid for dinner last time, you get the drinks this time. But happier, longer-term couples, they're generally less likely to be meticulously tracking who did exactly what when.
That makes sense. Less scorekeeping sounds healthier.
It generally is. However, equity, that sense of overall fairness, that still really matters over the long run. If one partner consistently feels like they're putting in way more or getting way less back, that will tend to breed resentment and hurt the relationship. And interestingly, the sources point out the partner who feels they're getting too much, they might even feel guilty.
So it's not about a rigid day-to-day balance sheet, but more a general feeling that things are fair overall, that both people are pulling their weight and getting their needs met.
That seems to be the key, yeah.
Yeah.
In lasting relationships, partners are usually pretty attuned to each other's needs. They try to meet them equitably, but they're also aiming for that communal mindset. The focus is more on the U.S., the relationship's well-being, not just a personal tally.
And I guess as relationships get more serious, life just naturally gets more tangled up, right? Shared homes, maybe kids, finances.
Absolutely. That complexity leads to a much, much higher degree of interdependence. Partners start relying heavily on each other for all sorts of practical things.
Like what?
Coordinating schedules, managing household tasks, handling money, definitely providing emotional support during tough times, maybe caring for kids or even aging parents together. This deep reliance just navigating daily life together is a fundamental difference between those long-term committed relationships and, more casual ones.
Okay, now for the big question, maybe. We talked about that initial spark potentially fading a bit, but can that intense romantic passion actually last? Or is it just something you remember fondly?
Ah, yes. This is where some brain science gets really exciting, actually.
Uh.
Research, like a well-known study from Harvard and Stony Brook using MRI scans, suggests romantic love can and does persist. For decades even.
Seriously, how did they test that?
They scanned the brains of couples who'd been married for 20 years or more, and they found that the same dopamine-rich brain areas, the ones associated with that intense falling in love feeling in new couples, they were still highly active in these long-married folks.
No way. So those couples who say, oh, we're still madly in love after 30 years, their brains might actually back that up.
The science absolutely supports that possibility. It suggests you can maintain that intense romantic feeling alongside the security and comfort of a long partnership. Some researchers even talk about the rustiness phenomenon.
Rustiness.
Yeah, like life gets busy, routines set in, and you can get out of the habit of romantic intimacy. It's not necessarily that the capacity for it disappears, just that it gets a bit rusty.
Okay, and can you polish off the rust? Can you rekindle that?
The research suggests yes, definitely. Things like sexual activity, for example, are often highlighted. It can boost oxytocin, reactivate those key brain reward circuits, potentially increasing desire and helping reignite that romantic flame.
That connects directly to something I see discussed all the time, especially in online communities.
Yeah.
Is attraction just there, automatic? Or is it something you have to consciously work at in a long relationship?
That's a really common thing people wrestle with, for sure. And the perspective that comes through very strongly in discussions among long-term partners, like in those forums we looked at, effort is crucial.
Effort in what way, though? Does that mean you have to constantly, put on a show for your partner?
Not quite like performing, no.
Oh,
It's more the idea that attraction isn't static.
Yeah.
It's not just fixed from day one. It can grow, but it also needs nurturing.
Hmm.
People in these discussions talk a lot about how building deep trust, relying on each other, developing profound respect over years, that can actually make a partner more attractive than they were initially, sometimes even more so than just the initial physical appeal. They also point out, very realistically, that attraction naturally ebbs and flows. It changes with life circumstances, how you feel about yourself, and really importantly, the overall quality of communication and connection in the relationship.
So if a couple starts feeling like roommates, maybe it's less about losing that initial physical attraction and more about stopping the things that actually build and maintain attraction over time.
That's a huge theme that comes out of those real-world discussions, yeah.
Yeah.
If you stop making those conscious efforts, doing thoughtful little things, prioritizing quality time, maintaining intimacy, it's not really surprising if that feeling of attraction shifts or feels dormant.
Right.
And while, yes, physical changes with age are real and happen to everyone, a deep, positive connection can genuinely make your partner seem more attractive to you, sometimes in really profound ways.
That idea of perception shifting based on the connection's depth, that's incredibly powerful.
It really is. And, it's important to acknowledge something else that came up, particularly in those online communities where people share very personal things. Sensitive challenges like the impact of past trauma, sexual assault, was mentioned on intimacy and attraction in long-term relationships. Navigating that takes immense effort, patience, often professional therapy. It requires deep respect for a partner's needs, their boundaries around intimacy. It's often about rebuilding emotional safety, which is a huge undertaking.
Absolutely. That's a critical point. Okay, let's shift gears a bit to personality. We always hear those cliches, right? Opposites attract or birds of a feather flock together. How much do our basic traits like being outgoing or agreeable actually play into relationship happiness?
Well, individual personality traits definitely matter. Thinking about the Big Five model, that's neuroticism, or its flip side, emotional stability, extroversion, openness, agreeableness, and conscientiousness, these traits do relate to relationship satisfaction.
How so?
Your own personality obviously affects how happy you are in the relationship. That's called the actor effect. But your partner's personality also impacts your satisfaction, the partner effect.
Gotcha. Are there any traits that consistently pop up as being really important for good relationships?
High emotional stability, which means low neuroticism, seems very important. High neuroticism is pretty consistently linked to relationship difficulties. Agreeableness, also comes up a lot as being strongly linked to higher satisfaction.
Okay.
And some studies, especially those looking at couples married for a very long time, also suggest conscientiousness is beneficial too.
Right. So the individual traits themselves matter, but what about the match? Does being similar to your partner on these traits actually make you happier together? Like two introverts, are they better off than an introvert and an extrovert?
Okay, this is where we hit a really surprising finding from some very large studies. We're talking data from the UK, Australia, Germany, Finland. Big data set.
And what did they find?
When the researchers carefully controlled for the effects of each person's individual personality traits, they found that personality similarity itself was not a significant predictor of relationship satisfaction.
Seriously. So the whole opposites attract versus birds of a feather debate in terms of these core personality traits. This research says it doesn't really matter for satisfaction.
According to these large studies, no. The individual traits themselves, like being agreeable or emotionally stable, matter much more than whether you match your partner on those traits.
Wow, okay.
Now, what does seem to matter, especially in studies focusing on those long-wed couples, is how you perceive your partner.
How you see them.
Yeah, couples tend to be happier when they see their partner in a generally positive light, sometimes even viewing them as having more positive traits or fewer negative ones than the partner might even see in themselves. Researchers call this positive reporting discrepancy.
Huh. So maybe it's less about finding your personality clone and more about genuinely appreciating and maybe slightly idealizing the person you're actually with.
That certainly seems to be a key takeaway from this line of research, yeah.
Speaking of things that aren't always smooth, conflict. It happens in every single relationship, right? Is conflict always a bad sign?
Conflict is totally normal. Honestly, it's probably unavoidable if you're deeply connected with another person. And actually, working through minor conflicts constructively can make a relationship stronger. The real issue isn't whether you have conflict, but how you handle it.
Okay, so how do couples in those lasting, happy relationships tend to handle disagreements? What does the research say?
A huge finding, particularly from John Gottman's extensive work, is the importance of positive interaction during conflict. He talks about maintaining a ratio.
A ratio.
Yeah, roughly 5 positive interactions for every 1 negative interaction, even when you're in the middle of a disagreement.
5 positives for every negative.
Why?
While arguing. That sounds difficult. What counts as a positive in that moment?
Well, it can be things like using humor appropriately, of course, to lighten the mood. Active listening, really trying to understand where your partner is coming from, showing affection, even a touch on the arm, expressing empathy, like saying, I can see why you'd feel that way, and crucially, collaborative problem solving, approaching the issue as us against the problem, not me against you, trying to find a solution together.
And conversely, what are the danger signs? The patterns that predict trouble.
The classic destructive patterns are things like stonewalling, just shutting down, withdrawing completely, defensiveness, harsh criticism, contempt. Those are really damaging.
Got it.
On the positive side, another thing linked to better outcomes during tough times is something called dyadic coping.
Dyadic coping.
Yeah, it basically means partners working together collaboratively to manage stress, whether it's stress from inside the relationship or outside like job loss or illness, supporting each other through challenges as a team. And specifically, research shows that using a collaborative conflict resolution style generally predicts higher relationship satisfaction.
This idea of patterns, it makes me think about attachment styles again. You mentioned earlier how those early experiences shape us.
Absolutely. Our attachment styles, those patterns of relating we develop in childhood based on interactions with caregivers, they really do have a lasting influence on our adult relationships.
How do those early patterns actually show up decades later?
Well, we usually talk about a few main styles: secure, anxious, or ambivalent, and avoidant. Sometimes a fearful avoidant style, too.
Right.
And these styles tend to shape things like how comfortable we are with intimacy and closeness, how we communicate our needs, especially when we feel stressed or threatened in the relationship, and, yeah, our overall satisfaction.
And the insecure styles.
And secure styles, both anxious and avoidant, are generally associated with more conflict, more communication difficulties, and often lower relationship satisfaction. Those early relational blueprints really do cast a long shadow.
Okay, let's bring this right up to the present day. Online dating. It's such a huge part of how people meet now. What do the sources tell us about that whole landscape?
Yeah, it's definitely changed things. Data from places like Pew Research shows a pretty significant chunk of adults have used dating sites or apps.
Mm.
It's more common among younger adults, LGB individuals, people with some college education, and slightly more common for men than women, interestingly.
Why are people using them? Is it mostly for casual stuff, or are people looking for serious relationships there?
It's a mix, for sure. Casual dating and sex are definitely reasons for some. But a large percentage of recent users in one survey said a major reason they were using them was specifically to find a long-term partner or spouse.
Okay.
People also use them just to make friends sometimes, or for fun.
And can you actually form real deep connections that start online? There's still this idea sometimes that it's all superficial.
Research actually indicates that people absolutely can form close, meaningful relationships online. And maybe a bit counterintuitively for some, other studies have found that using the internet can actually correlate with spending more time with your physically close friends and family,
Huh. Interesting.
and even with better psychological health sometimes. So it seems online connections aren't necessarily just replacing face-to-face ones. They can be additive, complementary.
That's actually kind of reassuring, though using dating apps isn't always smooth sailing, right?
Oh, definitely not. Recent online daters report a real roller coaster of feelings. Excitement when things click, sure, but also frequent disappointment, and sometimes feelings of insecurity or just being totally overwhelmed by the whole process. It can be tough.
Yeah, I bet. And of course, the reality is, not every relationship lasts. Breakups happen, and they're often incredibly painful.
They really are. The sources definitely acknowledge that breaking up, especially ending a long-term relationship, is a deeply painful experience. It involves loneliness, the loss of that significant social support, that interdependence we talked about earlier. It's a major life disruption.
That feeling of rejection must be particularly hard to deal with.
It is. Research suggests feeling rejected specifically can really intensify the pain. It can lead to more sadness, anger, maybe focusing inward on what's wrong with you.
Oof.
But the research also notes that while it's incredibly difficult, that experience can sometimes act as a catalyst. It can motivate people to eventually seek out new social connections, maybe focus on personal growth.
And people do recover. They move on.
Yes, absolutely. While there can definitely be short-term psychological struggles, the typical path is one of adjustment over time. People do recover, and very often they go on to form new, healthy relationships.
Okay. So if we try to pull this all together, everything from brain chemistry and personality to how we fight to how we meet people online, what are some of the really key takeaways for building and keeping these long-lasting, fulfilling connections?
Well, it really circles back to a lot of the things we've touched on. Prioritizing those positive interactions is huge. Really aiming for that 5-to-1 ratio, even when things are stressful. Actively listening. Showing empathy and affection consistently. Approaching problems as a team. That collaborative problem-solving thing.
So really fundamental communication skills,
Yeah.
and just consistently making the effort to be kind and understanding, even when it's difficult.
Precisely. Also, consciously making efforts to do things, please your partner. Making time to actually have fun together. Keeping shared interests alive. Trying to maintain a generally positive mood around each other, apparently. Happiness can be kind of contagious within a couple.
Right.
And that idea we mentioned earlier about holding a slightly idealized, positive view of your partner, that seems linked to greater satisfaction, particularly in those really long marriages.
Yeah.
Being generous in your interpretations.
Are there specific, tools or strategies couples can use to work on this stuff?
Yes, definitely. The sources mentioned various structured approaches, the kind therapists often use, but couples can use them too. They often focus on specific skills like conflict resolution techniques, improving communication patterns, or identifying shared goals in areas where the relationship could grow. They provide a framework.
Wow. Okay. Looking at all this, it really seems clear that relationship longevity isn't just some accident, right? It's not just finding the one or getting lucky. It's this dynamic mix of feeling close, navigating being interdependent, some surprising brain chemistry, and crucially, just constant conscious effort. Communication, how partners see each other and interact year after year.
Exactly. And while those early foundations, like attachment styles, are definitely important and shape things, so many of the key factors for long-term happiness really involve ongoing choices, developing skills, and the willingness of both partners to keep investing in the connection.
So, maybe here's a final thought for you listening. If the research is telling us that matching personalities isn't the secret sauce, and that conflict is basically guaranteed even in the best relationships, Maybe the real secret isn't finding a perfect match who never annoys you or disagrees with you. Maybe it's more about the ongoing process. The process of genuinely trying to understand, accept, and consistently interact positively with the unique, flawed, wonderful person you choose to build a life with, especially when things inevitably get tough. What does shifting to that perspective mean for how you approach the relationships in your own life?